polarisation industry. How can our divisions be overcome? And our special guest I'll introduce in just a moment. So the session abstract suggests successful societies require competent and compassionate leadership on the one hand and social solidarity and trust on the other. How do we end up with excesses of both incompetence and social division? If Steven Pinker is correct in arguing that the human race has never had it so good, what are we missing? Who and what are driving this division? What are the ways to drive people back towards consensus? What is the path back to shared prosperity? And to talk to this subject, the very well qualified Professor Stephen Kotkin, Head of International Affairs of Princeton University, joins us now from New York City. Good morning, or good evening rather, Stephen, welcome.
Great to see you again, Colin.
Great to see you, and great to see you looking so well. This is our, I think, 9th year or 10th year together, and yet another Fiduciary Investors Symposium. And you once again predicted the election scenario that we currently find ourselves. So let's start. Opening question. How do you characterise the current US election result?
So it was a thrilling result, not because of the outcome only for some people, but because of the process. We had 152 million people vote, the highest percentage of eligible voters in the US in a century voted. It was a free and fair election. No intimidation, no violence, no coups, none of the doomsday scenarios came out. The US system worked. The system worked and the institutions are strong. People need to remember that the US system was not designed for good politicians. It was designed for venal politicians. The framers who designed the US system were afraid that the politicians would be less than admirable. And so they designed a system to limit the ability to exercise power and to force agreement, consensus, coalition in order to get anything done. And so the genius of our system is that even with bad people, we can still get sometimes good results. A second point is that President Trump was repudiated. Biden won a very significant victory. You know, he won 50.9% of the popular vote. The last time an incumbent president was beaten by a challenger who got 50.9% of the vote was when? It was Franklin Roosevelt against Herbert Hoover in 1932. So people have to understand that even though we have this electoral college, which makes the elections seem closer than they are, it's a significant victory repudiation of President Trump. The third point I'd like to make quickly is that it was actually a double repudiation. It wasn't just President Trump who was repudiated, but the democracy in crisis crowd was also repudiated. You know, when the voters don't vote the way you want them, democracy's in crisis. We have to be very careful with this democracy in crisis type of stuff, right? There was a backlash against the racialism. The racialism failed. People of color is a failed self-defeating strategy. Hispanics and Latinos did not identify themselves this way. And in fact, Trump's vote among Black people increased this time since the last time, 2016. Americans are increasingly mixed, interracial marriage. They don't identify racially the same way that they used to. And so the racialism was also repudiated. That's very, very important. And so this double repudiation was a sensible outcome and shows the kind of middle of the road, moderate place that most of the American public is in, right? We know that 25% or so of Americans are liberal, and 29% are conservative, and 40% are moderate. That's the electorate. and they repudiated the extremes and give them credit. There was a kind of genius in that.
So, Stephen, given what you've just said, why do we have President Trump not yet conceding, and that we still have a situation where there seems to be a large, noisy group suggesting that there was widespread electoral corruption?
So President Trump is behaving now the way he has behaved the entire time. Anybody who expected anything different from him wasn't paying attention. Moreover, his million-man march in Washington the other day on behalf of fraud drew 5,000 people. And he drove by in his armored limousine and then went to the golf course. So once again, we have to be careful of the images versus the reality of what's going on in the country. This is the problem with the election. The election was a total success, but still the vast majority of working people in the United States are not represented in the political system. That is to say, people who work for a living, people who are on wages, not necessarily salaries, people who get by paycheck to paycheck, they're not necessarily represented by either party. And this is our lingering problem, right? The lingering problem, the policy failures, the elite unaccountability, the fact that the elites have not been held accountable, and the fact that the vast majority of Americans are not well represented in the political system. So the noise, the Trump, the show, the catastrophe, the apocalypse, and all of this kind of stuff, right, is not actually what is happening in the country.
What does this now mean for policy implications and, in fact, for our audience, investor implications?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. So the voters have called Joe Biden's bluff. Joe Biden said that he can be the unifier, that he can get Republicans to work with him. And so what the voters did was they elected Joe Biden, and they elected, it looks like, a Republican Senate. The Republicans have held the Senate. So Biden's bluff has now been called. It was a genius move on the part of the electorate. So you'll also notice that Biden is denying the Trump fire oxygen. He's not screaming bloody murder. He's not saying it's the end of the civilization in the United States or the world. He's saying it's embarrassing. And so the way a fire burns itself out is you deny it oxygen. Now, on the specific policies, we're obviously going to have to deal with the virus. We're not blessed to be able to live in Australia. We live in the United States here. And so we need to get a grip on the virus, and we need to manage the economic fallout, certainly in the near term. Beyond that, there's a whole lot of possible consensus. Broadband expansion for rural communities. That's the base of the Republican Party now, and it's an infrastructure investment that Biden could very well put at the top of his agenda. Community colleges and vocational training. The vast majority of people go to school in the United States, not at Harvard or Stanford, but at community colleges, which are underfunded. In addition, not everybody needs to go to college. They need to learn skills in vocational programs. So there could be a human capital consensus approach here. In addition, the anti-monopoly stuff. Both sides understand that the economy has become too monopolized by a few dominant players and that barriers to entry are too hard. We could go on. Manufacturing, strategic industries, U.S. R&D, right? The entire agenda about investment in the U.S., which both sides agree is necessary, and a deal can be made. It requires Biden to govern from the center, and it requires Republicans to be cooperative, not to be obstructionist, but to be cooperative. It remains to be seen, but I'm optimistic that the option is there if both sides want to exercise it.
Well, Stephen, I'm certainly pleased to hear and share in your optimism. However, I also recall 4 years ago when you spoke to this audience, your complete understanding for the phenomenon of Trump, why he was then elected, and it seems to me that nothing much has changed in your country to in fact remove that issue. So I'd frame the question this way: there's actually a question from the audience saying, if the people repudiated Trump, why was he able to increase his votes by 5 to 6 million? I'd add to the question and say, what are the long-term trends at play that produce and sustain polarisation?
So Biden won because women in the suburbs voted against Trump. They swung massively in Biden's direction. Biden did not increase his vote in the inner cities. He did not increase his vote with your traditional Democratic constituencies. He increased his vote with suburban women. So not Milwaukee, but outside Milwaukee, tipped Wisconsin. Not Detroit, but outside the city, tipped Michigan. Not Philadelphia, but outside the city. This goes for Atlanta, outside Atlanta suburbs, which tipped Georgia, and outside Phoenix suburbs, which tipped Arizona. This is a major and remarkable possibility for the Democrats to seize. Trump's coalition held. Trump's voters, your lesser educated working people, they stuck with him. But you have to understand that Trump is a coalition in addition to a phenomenon. There's three parts to Trump. There is the cult of Trump itself, right? The circus, the roiling resentment, the fact that people should feel ashamed, but Trump makes them feel pride in what they should feel ashamed about. But that's only part of it. The other part of it are traditional values, people who are anti-abortion, people who are social conservatives, people who go to church and believe in God, including Hispanics, where Trump increased his vote substantially. In addition, there's the economic liberalization position of what you might call the one percenters, another traditional Republican constituency. So if you put together the social conservatives with the economic liberalization crowd, you don't have a majority. Even when you put Trump into the picture and his personality, you still don't have a majority. Trump never had a majority. He didn't win a majority in 2016. He has no majority in 2020. And he was never over 50% for the first time ever in approval. So that constituency is there, but it's not a majoritarian constituency. And big parts of it have nothing to do with Trump. So when Trump goes away, the Republican side of the political spectrum has a major challenge here, which is to say the social conservative economic liberal coalition is insufficient for them. And so Trump may succeed in moving that party towards a more genuinely working people's, genuinely populist direction. On the Democratic side, we have the same struggle between the far left and the center left, which is a perennial, and they're coming to grips with that balance in their coalition. And so they'll have to figure that out too. So there's opportunity here for a genuine populism, not a show, not a circus, not a burn down the house, but a genuine series of policies that addresses real concerns of working people that both sides need for their coalition. And so the Trump phenomenon could have long-lasting consequences if it moves both parties towards recognizing that unserved constituency. You know, on the long term, you asked about the long term, right? So we have a structural problem. We have a structural problem in our political systems across the world that are democratic. And that structural problem is, where do people with traditional values go? Where do people who don't like abortion, go to church, believe in God, believe that marriage is only for a man and a woman, where do they go? Are they racist? Are they bigots? Or are they social conservatives? And where are they represented in the political spectrum? If you have an establishment which denies the legitimacy of a large part of the electorate, it's available for demagoguery. It's available to be mobilized and manipulated because it has nowhere else to go. So we need a center right and a center left party, right? We also need to watch this polarization industry like you're talking about, right? We've seen that they make money off of extremism and outrage. Extremism and outrage is their business model. The more people are outraged, the more money they make. The more people are polarized, but actually, Colin, it's not polarization, it's demonization. There were two recent experiments that your audience needs to know about, and I'll conclude with this. One was exposing people to media from the other side. So if you watch only conservative media, but then you're exposed to liberal media or vice versa, what are the effects? And the effect was increased intransigence because the media of each side was extremist. But there was a second experiment where people were not exposed to media from the other side, but they were exposed to individuals from the other side. And they got to know them in focus groups as people in a respectful setting. And lo and behold, they became less extreme, more empathetic, more reasonable, and more centrist. So the polarization industry's business model is a fundamental problem for every democratic society. And we need some way to manage that while keeping the freedom of open expression.
Thanks, Professor. You'll be pleased to know that the hours we spent preparing the next 20 questions we're going to abort, as we now have so many questions from the audience that this will, I'm sure, consume the rest of the time. So let's keep the answers brief if you can. First question, Stephen, you remarked before that few people have lost the US presidency as much as Biden throughout his long career. Does this result suggest that he's gotten better or the US political system has gotten worse?
So Biden has gotten significantly better in the sense that he met the moment. He's a man of fundamental decency and integrity. So he's kind of like a political antidote. We're all waiting for the vaccine, for the pandemic, for the virus. And Biden turned out to be a kind of political vaccine. Now, he's been much better at managing the campaign. He let Trump be Trump, which was the way Biden won. Biden just let Trump have the stage, and Trump undermined himself. Trump appointed himself the chair of Biden's campaign and drove Biden's numbers higher. So that was very clever, and he's handled the transition well by not overreacting to Trump, as I was suggesting, but all the challenges lay ahead. The relationship with the majority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell. We have to see Biden succeed in that. The relationship with managing the passions of the leftist wing or so-called progressive wing of the party. Managing the China relationship, right? It's all well and good to criticize Trump's approach to China, but what's a smart and successful China policy? All of that remains yet to be seen.
So three people have asked a question similar to this. How can you call this election a success? What was Biden's platform? He barely came out to campaign and didn't take questions from the press.
So it was a success, once again, in terms of process, in terms of the voters. The voters were able and did express their views. 151 million, highest percentage of eligible voters in a century. In addition, women, 53% of the electorate. They were the decisive vote. And there are more women in our Congress now than ever before, starting this January when they're sworn in. So all of those trends are positive trends. As far as the issues being occluded, once again, Here we have the polarization industry. The polarization industry needs that for its business model. And it feeds on it. You know, Trump was used by every constituency. He was used by the Republicans in the Senate. He was used by the polarization industry. He was used by the Democrats to rally and unite. When they don't have that crutch anymore, we'll see what they can do. But you're right that Biden did not enunciate policies in the same way as normal, and that's because there was no way to get those across in the Trump dumpster fire that we had and that we're now going to get beyond. So it will be up to Biden to enunciate those policies and build a consensus after the fact rather than before the fact. So your questioner is correct.
I'll be very quick here. We've got dozens of questions coming through. David Hartley, Chair of Australian Catholic Super Investment Committee, is asking, are the actions of Trump to incite reactions against the results of the election within the definition of the crime of sedition?
Once again, it's very good that Trump was repudiated at the ballot box. Many people were in favor of impeachment. Even if you agreed that Trump committed the crimes of which he was accused, impeachment was a second best option if you agreed that he committed those crimes. Some people, of course, disagreed. Getting voted out of office was the first best option, and that's happened. And there's no way for him to overturn that result. And in fact, Republican establishment and Republican voters are not stupid. They're quite sophisticated and smart people. And so they understand what happened, and they understand that there's a path forward. And so it's not about Trump anymore. It's about the system coming together to build consensus on both sides. It's on both sides to do that.
More audience questions. Dr. Kotkin, Nixon coined the term that he represented the silent majority. Is there a danger that Biden offers an imaginary majority?
There's nothing imaginary about the votes. Biden outpolled the Democratic Party very significantly. In fact, in many places where Biden was victorious, the Democratic congressman or senator couldn't match Biden's numbers. There definitely was a vote for Biden. Part of it was against Trump, but part of it was what Biden represents: decency, unification, integrity. We hope to have measures, political integrity measures, that are passed on a bipartisan basis that would cap the approach that Biden took, right? The empathy, the integrity, the decency, those are all big issues. And they're non-trivial, and he won because of them. So this is not to make Biden into superhuman. Biden, like all politicians, is a flawed person, and he would be the first to admit that.
Okay, really not to trivialise the answers, but a quick yes, no if you can. We've got about 6 minutes to go. I'm only going to preference the questions now that people have given their names to rather than the anonymous ones. Andrew Mowat of Regnan, part of Pendle Group. Will the Democrats try to restrict big tech monopolistic business practices? Yes or no if you can, Stephen?
Yes, and the Republicans will join them. Whether the big tech can beat that back, we'll see. But the answer is yes.
Andrew Paulson, who is the head of Frontier Advisors, the largest asset consultant here in Australia. Andrew is asking, how important will the US signing up to climate change responsibilities be for transforming the US economy and, in fact, the rest of the world?
It won't be as important as the relationship with China. Without a partnership with China, there will be minimal progress on climate. So Biden has to figure out how to maintain deterrence with China and resume some forms of cooperation, including in the critical climate sphere.
And we'll note that the next session you'll actually be interviewing Professor Michael Pettis from China, from Beijing, on the issue of the relationship with China, particularly under now President Biden. Michael McQueen, the Chief Investment Officer of Media Super. What is the solution for poor representation of society in government? After Macron won, France asked for train drivers, teachers, etc. to apply to the Senate, but then experienced the yellow vest movement.
Once again, here we have the contradiction between signing those international agreements and building solidarity at home, right? The Paris Agreement was signed in France, and the one attempt that the French government made to implement some version of it produced mass unrest. And so the elites cannot impose climate solutions on the populace. They must be organic with the people, and they must take into account costs domestically, not just costs to the environment. So a smart climate policy is a solidarity rooted in national consensus policy, or it's not going to work. You can't build international solidarity if you have domestic lack of solidarity. The French case shows that. So I think the solution is you do what you can at home, get your own house in order before you make promises at the international level that you cannot deliver at home.
Dr. Finch of Saki Partners is asking the question, Dr. Kotkin, what parallels does history offer us with the protracted 2020 election? Given the electorate's decision to call Biden's bluff, does this mean that the attention now turns to foreign policy given an inability to achieve his domestic agenda?
So once again, your earlier question has pointed out that we're not sure what Biden's domestic agenda is yet. And so we'll see it unfold. And Biden's domestic agenda would have been limited even if the Democrats had taken the Senate, which is not out of the question because, as you know, there are two runoff elections in Georgia, January 5th, to determine control of the Senate. Because there are conservative Democrats in the Senate, like Joe Manchin of West Virginia. And so even with a 50-50 majority, not implement an agenda that was against the conservative wing of his own party, let alone the other party. So I think that the forcing Biden to come to grips with the need to build consensus with the other side and vice versa, the onus on the other side, is a very good outcome if we get the competence that I was talking about earlier that you introduced our session with, right? People have to build consensus, as you know, from running an organization. It doesn't just arise automatically. It's not imposed by the CEO. It's built organically into the culture. It's there for the taking. Both sides can do it, but they must rise to this occasion. We'll see, but it can happen. That's the difference. The difference between now and 2016 is a consensus is possible, which was not the case then.
Alex Wise, who's the head of Castle Hall Consulting, asks, an alternative view is that social conservatives are in fact overrepresented by Trump in the Senate and especially in the Supreme Court. What are the risks to liberal values such as Roe versus Wade posed by the Supreme Court?
So the court system is not a good place to make any social policy. The court system should have a more limited role, in my view. If you look at social conservatives, they have no place whatsoever in universities. They have almost no place in the media. They have very few places in the establishment beyond the court system, if you look very closely. And so in sports, Hollywood, even now in corporate America, everyone is genuflecting, right, towards the cultural leftism. And so we need to rebalance that a little bit, and we need to reduce the role of the courts. So I agree that some people don't like social conservatives. But remember, some people don't like socially liberal, and we need to be able to live with both people. The thing about polarization, Colin, is a big society, even on the size of Australia, let alone America, is expected to have diverse political views. Your audience runs the spectrum here, from left to right and everything in between. The issue is not polarization. It's not diversity of views. It's the ability not to demonize others for their views and to be able to take them into account empathetically and to build policies that aren't radical and exclusionary while at the same time upholding certain values. This can be done. We used to do this, Colin.
So, Professor Kotkin, as a Russian historian and, in fact, author of several books on Stalin that are bestsellers, Sarah Megson is asking, what do you make of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's plans to making lists of those that they perceive to have helped Donald Trump? Isn't that fascism?
Unfortunately, the left is very good at discrediting itself. When the vast majority of people were sympathetic because of George Floyd's murder, they came up with defund the police and muddied the waters. You could go on and you could go on, right? The left, it fantasizes about policies that are not achievable in the United States and that only serve the function of galvanizing anti-leftist voting in the United States. This is where Biden has been much smarter. Now, they're entitled to their views. The left and the right are fully entitled to their views, and we have no desire to suppress them, but some ideas undermine themselves. They're self-defeating.
So that's a good lead on final question, also from the audience. What do you make of the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa in terms of its influence in this election?
The racial awakening that we had in the United States was very salutary. It brought together the country. It brought together a lot of people who had not been paying attention to the issue. But once again, it was occluded. We had the civil rights movement, Colin. We have a black middle class and a black upper middle class that we didn't have when I was younger, when I was going through school. Our policies worked. There was tremendous social mobility for large numbers of blacks. You see now, they're chiefs of police, they're mayors of cities, they're running organizations, they're running corporations. Where did that come from? That came from the struggle of the civil rights movement, which was not a racial movement, but was a broad, all the way across every race and every category movement. There were plenty of white people in that movement. You are not ipso facto racist because you're white, right? In fact, the whites were critical for the success of the civil rights movement, just as they need to be today for the elimination of the kind of stuff we saw in the case of George Floyd. So we need to not occlude that with some type of racialization of the population, right? Martin Luther King was about all Americans being equal, right? It was not a racialist position that he took on behalf of justice. And so that's within our grasp. And we had that moment, and that moment is not lost. And Joe Biden can latch onto that moment. And in fact, the country is there, including people who voted Republican.
We are over time, but I'm going to ask just one final question. It's from Jenny Ning, and the question is, how can universities address the issue of cancel culture that are suppressing debate? And I guess to close the conversation out, Professor, and as a former Vice Dean also of Princeton University, what are the future of these great schools post-COVID, hopefully next year?
Cancel culture is a menace, and we need to not be afraid to stand up to it. We need to call it out because cancel culture is a minority of people. They're a loud minority, but they're a minority. Overwhelming majority is against cancel culture. And so if some people stand up, cancel culture won't be effective. The universities in the United States are amazing institutions. They have a lot of issues that they need to confront. But there's a reason that foreign students up until the Trump organization were increasing in numbers in studying in the US, just as they study in Australia, just as they study in the UK, because you can't beat a free and open system, and you can't beat investment in human capital. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a pleasure always. Thanks for being such a good friend of our firm, Connexus, and of mine personally.